Greetings. My name is Kimberly, and this is an interview with Karen Hudes that was recorded on October 25th, 2013. Karen Hudes is a former counsel for the World Bank. She worked as an attorney in the legal department from 1986 to 2007. And while she was there, she discovered a lot of fraud and corruption. And she's been speaking out about it ever since she found out about it. I only learned about her this year, and I'm certainly glad that I did. If you want to follow up on this, her website is kahudes.net. Thank you for listening. Karen, what a pleasure to meet you and get a chance to talk with you. How are you?
I'm fine, and I'm delighted to be with you today, Kimberly.
Thank you very much. Some of the people listening to this are going to have been following you and your great work, and some of those are going to be listening to you for the first time. So for those that are listening for the first time, Karen was a lawyer at the World Bank for 21 years from 1986 to 2007. And what did you find there?
I found a lot, but the best thing that I found was other whistleblowers that were discovering the same kinds of corruption that I was discovering. I worked in the World Bank legal department, but I'm also an economist. I went to Yale Law School, and I also studied development economics at the University of Amsterdam. So I came to the World Bank in mid-career. I had actually always wanted to work for the World Bank, but I needed to get my credentials and practice as somebody who could represent a financial institution. So I worked on Wall Street in securities law as a corporate lawyer, and then I went to the U.S. Export-Import Bank, and then at that point I went to work for the World Bank. And before I went to the World Bank, I got to know a man who was a Dutch lawyer who had been at the Dutch embassy when the Bretton Woods treaties were being negotiated, and then he went on to serve as the longest-serving general counsel at the World Bank. I think he was there for 20 years. Anyway, his name was Aaron Brochus, and what he did was he gave me the operation manual for the World Bank, which is to say he told me what was in the treaty and why. And he also told me that in 1968, when Robert McNamara came to the World Bank as the World Bank president, and Robert McNamara was there for 10 years, he said that's when the World Bank started getting really corrupt, and that you had to really watch out for when somebody came to the World Bank to head it from the Pentagon. So I don't know if you want me to go into greater background, but I've been working together with the other whistleblowers that I got to know at the World Bank as a sting operation. And we've been assisted by a very, very accurate game theory model that came to us from a political scientist who had designed this for the defense industry. And this model is predicting that we're going to have rule of law. It started predicting that when I and a Scottish whistleblower named Elaine Colville got 3 statements up on the UK Parliament website. Our last statement we got up in July for the Public Administration Select Committee that wanted to know how good was the UK doing in processing complaints. And I said, you've been doing a lousy job. I've been telling you about world corruption, and you've been sitting on your hands, and we're about to land in a currency war. What do you guys think you're doing? And Elaine, she's really very, very active, and she had gone to, every single layer in her government. She had been working for the International Finance Corporation. The World Bank consists of 5 different, related companies that do different things. The World Bank is a cooperative that's owned by 188 countries. Mm-hmm. And it gets its budget, actually, by issuing bonds on the capital markets, $180 billion worth of bonds. And then it takes the money that it gets from the bonds and it invests them. And the profits are what pays for the budget. But every now and then, when a shareholder has to make a contribution to capital, you have to have equity in one of these entities. So the World Bank capital increase had to be approved by the U.S. Congress. And when the U.S. Congress appropriated this capital increase, they put a condition in there, and that's because I had gone to them to tell them about all of this corruption, and the World Bank stonewalled a Government Accountability Office inquiry that Senators Lugar, Leahy, and Bayh requested in 2008. So the condition says that the money from the U.S. taxpayers is only going to be dispersed when the effects of retaliation against whistleblowers have been eliminated. So that's one of the reasons for my optimism, because all of the countries that belong to the World Bank and the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve know that the complaints of the whistleblowers are having a real impact.
Yes, they are. Thank you, Karen. So, Karen, what steps did you take to expose the corruption at the World Bank, and what happened in 2007?
Well, in 2007, that was the year that I got fired. Mm-hmm. But I had been, I'm a sting operation is the best way to see me. I was there as a lawyer who knew about securities laws. And if the World Bank is issuing bonds on the capital markets and there's a cover-up of corruption, then it's the job of the lawyers inside the World Bank to get rid of that corruption. You cannot have a cover-up in an institution that is active in the capital markets, because the thing about cover-ups is if there's one cover-up, there's many cover-ups. It shows that something called internal controls are not there. If people are afraid to report money going in the wrong direction, then a lot of money is going in the wrong direction. So the financial reporting is not accurate. And the U.S. Congress had known, they'd been holding hearings on corruption at the World Bank. Some people in the accounting department had reported that the borrowers are being overbilled on the interest that they were being charged on their loans. That's pretty fundamental. And so in 2005, there was a very strict letter that went from the Joint Economic Committee of the U.S. Congress. That's a committee where you have people both from the House and the Senate. And that letter said that the accounting inside the World Bank was problematic, and that the World Bank had to solve the problem. And Senator Lugar had held a number of hearings. And so what happened in 2006 was I've been going to the Treasury Department. First I had stayed, the thing of a lawyer is you're supposed to go up the corporate ladder. And there's a very accurate, a very good chronology that shows exactly the steps that I had been taking. I'm a whistleblower that's a little bit different from other whistleblowers, like, for example, Edward Snowden, who's taking documents that might be considered to be confidential and revealing them. What I'm doing is I'm ending a cover-up. As a lawyer, that's my job, to end a cover-up inside a company that's issuing bonds. So what happened in 2007 was I had been going up the corporate ladder. I had been reporting corruption to the audit committee. I had had a meeting with the then president of the World Bank, which I had gone to, together with the government representative on the board from the Netherlands. We met with Jim Wolfenson. And, I had been on probation a couple of times. I had been involved in cover-up of corruption in the Philippines. There, it was a loan that ended up getting canceled, where we had to cancel $200 million, and the Japanese canceled $200 million. The president of the Philippines was fired for corruption. His name was Joseph Estrada. There was a bank run, and the Philippine Deposit Insurance Corporation had to bail out the Philippine National Bank, which was the second largest bank, for $500 million when the depositors withdrew the money that was on deposit. And then the World Bank Evaluation Department said that this World Bank supervision of the loan had been satisfactory, that all of this came as a nasty surprise. And I wrote the evaluation department, and I said, you're not telling it like it was. I was the country lawyer, and I told the man who was in charge of that project to warn the government that they wouldn't get their money. And instead, he tried to reassign me. And I went and I complained to my boss, the general counsel. And then I went and met with Jim Wolfenson together with Peter Steck. So you better not cover up this, we could have prevented everything terrible that happened in the Philippines, and we didn't. This was not satisfactory, and this is a cover-up. And then I was interviewed in 2006 for the job of general counsel, and during that interview, the executive search firm said, how come all of the general counsels are getting fired one after the other? I said, that's easy, because there's a cover-up of corruption. The World Bank internal controls are shot, and the World Bank needs to be brought into compliance. This is all technical words for saying that people who are buying World Bank bonds are clueless about the actual real financials of the World Bank, because anybody that wants to know where the money is will not find out, because anybody who sees the money getting laundered or an inaccuracy is getting fired. And Elaine Colville had seen that the salaries of the people in her unit were being double billed. So the people, whether the senior people were getting half of the second, and this is millions of dollars. Where was this extra, when there's a double billing, where was this extra money going? This is a big problem in an organization at the center of the international capital markets. So that was what was going on in 2007. I went to the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, and I said, I have been speaking to the German executive director. He's something called the Dean of the Board. He was the most senior person. He had been on the board longer than any of the other people representing their governments. I said, and Eckhard Deutscher is saying that the board is treated like a mushroom, kept in the dark and covered with fertilizer. And the other thing that I had said to the Treasury Department that year was I was reporting on a very accurate model using simulation. A political scientist named Jacek Kugler, who had developed this model for the defense intelligence community, came to the World Bank and said, this is a very good way of figuring out what the situation is for a project. And I took him with me to Ghana, and we were trying to figure out why a law on freedom of information wasn't getting passed. It turned out, using the country experts, we found out that the level of support for a perfect law was not there, that if the Germans were funding this project, if the Germans would accept an imperfect law, we could get that imperfect law passed. And so that's what we did. And then I asked Jacek, could I model rule of law at the World Bank using his model? And he said, sure. And that model in 2004 predicted that if the United States did not play by the rules, we were going to lose our leadership. There was something called the Gentleman's Agreement, which said that the United States could just handpick the president of the World Bank. And there's a sister organization called the International Monetary Fund right across the street from the World Bank. It's got the same exact countries that are members, and it does exactly the same thing that the World Bank does when you're trying to fix the financial sector in a country. For all practical purposes, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank are just one big organization as affiliates. So the way it worked is the president would come from the United States for the World Bank, and the managing director would come from Europe for the International Monetary Fund. That was their compromise when they set up these organizations in 1944. But we were going to lose the ability to handpick the president of the World Bank because of all this corruption. I told the Treasury Department and the U.S. Congress that that was the risk that we were running. And lo and behold, that's what exactly happened in 2010, although the American public didn't learn of this. I only found out after I was fired in 2007 that the corruption that I was reporting inside the World Bank was actually a microcosm of all of the corruption in the world. And I can say this with great accuracy because although I haven't gotten my story out to the public, Although, Kimberly, I'm thanking you for doing what you can.
Thank you.
But it turns out that the mainstream media in the United States is owned lock, stock, and barrel by a big, you could call it a mega bank. And some mathematicians discovered this situation, that all of the banks are actually working all together hand in glove as, one big, I guess they call it a combine. But the mathematicians from the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, Switzerland, that's known as the foremost university in Switzerland, what they did was they took accurate data on the 43,000 transnational companies whose stock is traded on the world's capital markets, and they modeled this, and that's when they found out that there was one set of directors that migrated from one of these entities to another, and that they were all interconnected. It's one big ball of wax. That's how come you've got this rigging of the prices in the capital markets. That's why you have insider trading. And the Federal Reserve System that's owned by just a very small handful of, their corporations that go on up into the stratosphere. And then, of course, there are families behind those. But this is all interconnected. And the central banks, the 58 central banks that are all members of the Bank for International Settlements. A lot of people think, oh, this is government, and they just sort of ignore what this is. It's a very, very dangerous situation. What you have is a handful of families that are controlling 60% of the annual earnings of all of the companies on the world's capital markets and 40% of the assets, the net value of these companies. But they're doing it not only secretly, but they're doing it with a minimum of investment. They have 10 times the power that you would expect somebody who had made an investment of that size to have. So they're just they're seizing control secretly is what they're doing, and they're exercising that control over the world's economies and the world's legislatures. That's what I discovered after I was fired.
Thank you very much. At this point, would you explain who owns the Federal Reserve?
Yes, it's these interlocking directors and these families. You've heard the name of the financial institutions, of course. It's Goldman Sachs, it's Citibank, it's Bank of America, it's Wells Fargo, it's Deutsche Bank. And then you've got some other entities on top of them called State Street Bank, Fidelity Bank. I think it's Blackwater. I don't have this in front of me, but I can give you the link to the study and you can see, exactly who that is. And then there are families behind those entities whose names everyone else has also heard of, and I've been criticized for not giving those names. So it's the Rockefellers, it's the Rothschilds, it's the Schiffs, and there are some other, Italian names that I've forgotten. But the other thing that I found is as soon as I find one layer, it turns out there's another secret layer behind that. So the secret layer behind that is that are controlling these entities. They're the Jesuits, they're the Knights of Malta, they're the Freemasons. There is a hierarchy of control and deliberate plans and sharing of information. It turns out that the intelligence agencies of these countries are all being supervised by one central intelligence agency coming out of the Jesuits.
Wow. And in the same vein, who owns and operates the IRS?
Okay. Now, when I first heard this, I couldn't believe it. I had to reread this about 6 times, so I don't blame your audience for saying this lady is just spinning tales. But a lot of people have a lot of documentation on this.
Yes, they do.
Yes. What happened, there have been a series of bankruptcies. Our Federal Reserve System was put into place in 1913 by stealth. Many of the Congress people went home, and then there was this legislation that passed, and President Wilson signed it into law. And then after that, instead of the Treasury issuing the U.S. currency, what you have is you have the Treasury issuing a promissory note, borrowing money from the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will then charge interest on this money. So we end up with interest on our country's currencies. You don't have that in another way when you issue the currencies yourself and you have the currencies backed by something of value. Then the money is worth something. And what happened in this situation is we went into bankruptcy as a country in the 30s. And what the Federal Reserve did at that point, I can't believe it, they incorporated all of the states. That means the states are now also companies. And they got the states to agree that whenever a baby is born and is issued a Social Security number, their birth certificate, if you read the birth certificate of your children, it's in all capital letters. Mm-hmm. Because what happens is the Federal Reserve estimates that your baby is going to be earning money and paying taxes in the future. And they say for each person, I think it's a sum of like $600,000 or $700,000 worth that they expect they're going to get. And they take this bond worth $700,000 and they issue it, and they earn interest on the bonds in the capital markets. And so when you pay your taxes, you know how you mail the check separately? Mm. The tax forms go one place and the check goes the other place. The Federal Reserve takes your check and they deposit it in the United Kingdom. And the United Kingdom takes 40% of your tax payments, and then they mail 60% off to the Vatican's bankers.
Now, wait a minute. You've got to explain that in more detail. Huh?
Absolutely. Huh? Our tax money is not staying in our country. Our tax money is going to the Federal Reserve, which, by the way, is owned by these people that have no loyalty to the United States. It's not our government. It's a private bank owned by private people, and if you want to know why it is that the Vatican is taking this money from the United Kingdom, it's because I think it was 1200 or so, there was one of the royalty in the United Kingdom had borrowed a lot of money from the Vatican and owed a lot of money and promised that they would be paying back this money that they owed to the Vatican, and that has stayed in place. So you know, we've got an interconnected problem. The whole world has this interconnected problem. It's like there are all kinds of analogies, but I think the best analogy that people will understand right off the bat is the Wizard of Oz. When I can't remember his first name, Baum wrote The Wizard of Oz. This was when the United States was considering issuing its own currency, and he wanted to be sure that it was going to be backed by gold. That's the yellow brick road. That's right. Supposed to be gold, and the slippers are not supposed to be emerald. They're supposed to be silver.
Right. In the book, they're silver.
That's right. And also the scarecrow, that's the agriculture in the United States. The Tin Man, that's industry. I was trying to figure out who the lion is. Do you remember?
You know, I just heard that recently, but I'm not.
Well, let me tell you who Toto is, pulling the curtains back. Toto is the World Bank Whistleblowers. And who's the Wizard of Oz? This little man who's projecting on a screen this terrible entity. That's the Federal Reserve. They don't want you to know that it's all done by smoke and mirrors. And the reason people are confused and why this message I'm giving you is so confusing is because you have accepted that screen up there as the reality. And that screen is actually the television shows that you're watching and the newspapers that you're reading, because they are all owned by the people that own the Federal Reserve System. And so this story that you're now hearing from Kimberly, I've been trying to tell this to you for the longest time. I tried to get the story out back in 2007 when I was fired because I wanted to prevent the U.S. from losing the gentleman's agreement to appoint the president of the World Bank. And now the reason that I've kept going is because this stakeholder analysis that I've been working from says we have, as a country, have a clear choice right now. We can choose to kick out the Federal Reserve and issue our own currency and have it backed by something of value, or we can have a currency war. And what's gone on with the U.S. dollar, you hear about the quantitative easing where every month all of these Treasury notes are being issued to the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is printing all of these dollars. This is absolutely weakening the U.S. dollar, and the rest of the world is not accepting it. Mm-hmm. So the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, decided that they're going to take the trade among themselves, and they're not going to finance that with dollars anymore. They're going to finance it, they call it barter. They're going to just offset who owes what to whom, and at the end of the day, when a country owes something to another country, they're going to settle that with gold. So where we are is people who are listening don't accept the news that you're hearing from the television set as news. That is the screen for the Wizard of Oz. That is just censoring all of the information that you need. And, why would they not have told this story that I'm telling you? It's pretty big. I mean, they've told you little bits and pieces of it. So I'll give you a for instance. During the election for the president, Mitt Romney had appointed as his National Security Transition Planning Chief Robert Zoellick, who used to be the president of the World Bank. And Robert Zoellick was denied a second term by the countries that are members of the World Bank because he was just there serving the interest of the super entity. He was not listening to the other countries, and the other countries are paying their taxpayers' money into the World Bank. They were entitled to a voice. They were entitled to get information on the board, which they weren't getting. The people inside the World Bank who were trying to tell the board what was really going on were getting fired. At a certain point, all of the countries asked for an inquiry. There was something called the Volcker Panel inquiry. Volcker came in and just looked at a group called the Institutional Integrity Department. You have to laugh because if there's ever been a group that had no integrity, it was them. That group was acting like a goon squad and would go around firing anybody that tried to tell the board what was going on. And there's a very accurate report about what happened with this inquiry because I went to them at the time, and also there were people inside that unit that were trying to tell Paul Volcker what was going on, and they were getting fired and harassed, and they ended up getting a big settlement because of this corruption. But the recommendations of the Volcker panel were never changed. It was never acknowledged that you had this problem. Just think about it. This is an organization that has a lot of money sloshing around. And if people know that the Institutional Integrity Department is going to be harassing them when they report corruption, how much of that money can be hijacked in the wrong direction? So this is a huge problem, and it never saw the light of day in the press. So anyway, let me get back to what was going on during the presidential election. So this is why Robert Zoellick was not given a second term. And here he shows up on Mitt Romney's, as a senior advisor to Mitt Romney. I wanted the American public to know this. I wanted CBS to ask a question that would make the candidates tell the American public what was going on. And this question never came. That's because the presidential debate team, they kicked out the League of Women Voters who used to run that. And now you just have senior officials from the Democrat and Republican parties. These parties have been totally co-opted by that super entity. We have corruption from top to bottom of our political system now. This is a huge problem, and what's happening as a result is we are about to lose our credit rating, because after Elaine Colville and I got our testimony in the UK Parliament, a UK lawyer called me and said, Karen, you ought to go to the credit rating agencies, because he didn't want the UK Parliament to be the only entity that was fighting this corruption. So I did. I went to Moody's, Standard & Poor, and Fitch Rating. And Standard & Poor downgraded the U.S. credit rating, at which point Eric Holder sued Standard & Poor, and the lawyer representing Standard & Poor said Eric Holder's lawsuit really took off, and there was a big crackdown when Standard & Poor lowered the credit rating. So now what did Standard & Poor do? Standard & Poor said, you know what, since the U.S. is the official reserve currency for the world, that means that when countries, unrelated countries, are paying for trade, they'll make those contracts in dollars. Well, that status is not continuing. I just finished telling you what was going on with 25% of world trade. Mm-hmm. But in addition, there's now a fourth credit rating agency that it's called the Universal Credit Rating Agency, and it's owned by Russia and China, and it's also got some other corporate interests in there. I'm meeting with the chief officer of that group in a couple of weeks, and if we don't have a good story to tell about how we're tackling this corruption, you better believe our credit rating is going to tank.
Where does the gold backwardation come into all this?
That's a wonderful question. I'm an economist, but the
maybe you should define what that is too.
Yes,
first, yeah.
I was going to say that the relationship of gold to currencies, this monetary economics, is a specialty, and I wasn't aware of it until about 4 or 5 months ago. I got a phone call from a Brazilian who published a newsletter for the precious metals traders. And that's when I realized that this corruption is not going to just continue indefinitely, that there's an absolute sunset date. And that's because of the markets. The markets really do send signals. Even if you have a huge corrupt entity that's manipulating the gold prices, which is what they've been trying to do. Mm-hmm. The way they've been doing this is...
Trying?
The way they do it is they promise to deliver gold at a date in the future, and they promise to deliver it at a very low price, but they will not honor that contract. It's called naked shorts. It's a funny word for it. But anyway, let's get back to what happened on July 7th. What the central banks do that own all this gold is they lease it. They keep it on their books as if they own it, but it goes off to another party who signs a contract, a lease contract. You know how you lease an apartment? Well, this second party is leasing the gold. But what happens is at the end of the lease term, they're not going to give back the gold. They're going to keep it. And then they're just going to give some money. And if money is losing its value, then the people who are pricing the lease contracts are going to make the payment, the amount of money that the party is going to have to pay if they don't return the gold, they're going to make that price very, very high. And so the cost of the lease got to be prohibitive. And so the leasing stopped in July. This is a very unusual event, and it happened in 1971 when the U.S., that was when the U.S. went off what we call the gold standard. Mm-hmm. It used to be that if you wanted, you could take your dollar and get gold for it in exchange. I think it was $35 an ounce. I think that was the price that was set. Well, the U.S. couldn't honor all the people that were turning in their dollars, and so they said, we're not doing this anymore. Well, this happened in July, and we are now in a situation where people don't trust the paper currencies anymore because it's a confidence game, and there has never been a paper currency that has continued without losing confidence. I used to work on Argentina in the beginning of the 80s. I was there when their currency crashed. I can tell you what it's like. It's impossible. You would go to make a payment of something, minor, and you'd have to have a stack of bills. And they kept adding the zeros at the end of the bills. And every day the prices would go up because the people had absolutely no confidence in their currency. And that's where we're headed with all of the paper currencies. And at a certain point, when you know that's where you're heading and you own gold, you are not going to sell gold at any price because there's no way to tell exactly when that paper currency is going to crash and burn, and you would much rather have gold than worthless dollars or whatever currency it is. And when you hit that point where people will not sell gold at any price, that's called permanent gold backwardation. And what happens at that point is that you cannot finance international trade. You have no way of settling the contracts because people don't know what to put for the price. The money is just valueless. And at that point, when you have no way to finance international trade, the repercussions are unimaginable. What happened in the 30s would pale by comparison. And so we're not going there. And what you see is the rest of the United States partners shielding themselves from this event. And what I've been doing is I had gone to the States a long time ago reporting this corruption. And I've been, I went to the attorneys general, all 50 of them. I bought a World Bank bond, and the people in the court, in the federal court, they were not acting like a court. They were acting like a kangaroo court. One day there was a filing deadline, and I went to, the night before the deadline, I went to read my brief just one more time. It's a good thing I did that because somebody had erased it from my computer. I had no brief. And then I said, I've attached this to some emails. The brief that was attached to the emails, somebody had gone through there, spent a lot of time and taken all of these cites. You have to cite the page of whatever statement because in a common law you have to have jurisdiction. Somebody had taken the trouble of just coming up with terrible cites, and there was no way in the remaining time to reconstruct that. Fortunately, I had, 2 weeks earlier, I had sent something through the cloud. So I was able to go up there, retrieve that document, stayed up all night, rewrote the brief, and then when I went and filed it, it was also crazy because, first of all, I realized that I had to correct something, and I went to a Staples or something.
Mm-hmm.
I must have been hit by a stun gun. I couldn't find my car after that. I had to get in a taxi and circle around. I finally found my car, and, I sort of staggered into the court, filed my paper, and then when I got home, I had learned to be careful and double check. I went back home, and the court had kicked out my document because of a minor technicality. But you can also file electronically, and luckily I was able to refile it before the deadline. I mean, wow. It was such a shambles, that court. So anyway, the judges started acting really bizarre. This is a little bit technical, but I'll tell you anyway. The lower court had kicked my case out. They had just dismissed it. And when you appeal that, the appellate court has to go back and look at all of the papers you filed from the beginning. That's called de novo. And what the court did was I went out on a blog, and I made a comment, and I said, the lawyer for the World Bank is part of this corruption I'm reporting. The board has got to manage the case itself. And then the next day, the panel of judges said, we are affirming the lower court decision. We're just going to take it without doing this de novo. So that was a wacky decision. And then they said, if Karen appeals this, we're going to charge her for the legal costs of all of the 4 parties she was suing. I'll tell you who I was suing. I was suing the World Bank. I was suing KPMG, the audit firm, because they didn't follow the audit standards. I was suing the medical insurance company because my husband and I had marital counseling, and the World Bank medical department found out from the medical insurance company, and this is coming, by the way, to anybody that's considering the Obamacare. Your medical information is not secure. Anybody can hack that stuff and pursue you with no medical confidentiality. That's not how our system works. And so the Aetna insurance company had been giving this information of who the identity was of the marital counseling I had gone to. And I saw on a blog the other day, people were talking about my mental health. They thought I was bouncing around too much. My statements were not easy enough to follow that showed I was schizophrenic because I had gone to this marriage counselor. I mean, that is bizarre.
Wow.
I mean, we are in a country which has not been declaring its whistleblowers to be insane. In any event, I was sort of prepared for this because at a certain point in my career in the World Bank, the health department is allowed to come up with something called fitness for duty assessments, and they wanted to intimidate me, and I don't intimidate. So they had a fitness for duty assessment, and I had them call up the man who was representing the Dutch government. And Peter Steck said to the doctor in the World Bank Health Unit, he said, I have seen other countries where they tried to declare their whistleblowers insane, but I didn't know that this was happening in the United States. And that's when the man in the health department ended that conversation. This is sort of a long-winded answer, but I'm just trying to give people a sense for what all is going on here. It is just unscrupulous. The people that are behind the Federal Reserve System think that they have enough power, and they bought up all the media, so nobody in this country is going to find out about what this is. But they didn't count for the fact that I was going to stick with the problem, I was going to work together with other whistleblowers, and that other countries were going to really be grateful for this, because what they don't want a currency war, which is where we're headed. They don't want a corrupt fiat currency. They don't want the Vatican collecting the tax payments of a country. They want a credible, strong, United States, and that's where we're headed.
Yay. I love your optimism on that. And
I've got that stakeholder analysis, and let me tell you why I'm optimistic, all right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not just that I got my statement up on the UK Parliament website or that I testified in the European Parliament. It's because as my story gains more and more publicity, more and more Americans come to me and we're joining forces. And, I was discussing this a little bit with Kimberly before the show, and I'm not going to go into great detail about who it is that's forming this coalition. But you just stay tuned. And in the meantime, you can be writing your county executives, because my county executive, Ike Leggett, was elected by the County Executives of America at their annual meeting in Fort Worth, Texas. At that point, I got a number of Americans to get in touch with their county executives.
And what do we write to them?
You write them and you say that Karen says we're taking our country back, and where do you stand on this?
Okay.
And they can, and you also say, and you can go to all of the other counties in whatever your state is, tell your county executive to do that, and to send a letter to the governor. And if you want to copy me on it, I'll forward this to the National Governors Association. Let me tell you what I've been doing with them, because when I went to see Ike Leggett's office just before the annual meeting of the World Bank, which took place earlier this month, he sent out one of his people who had worked for the National Governors Association, and that person said, go to the National Governors Association and tell them, that Ike Leggett's office sent you. So I did that, and I made it my business to go to the office in the National Governors Association where all of the financial officers are for the states. And, a lot of Americans thought, we avoided the debt ceiling. We managed narrowly to escape this. We didn't escape anything. I told you, don't believe a thing that you hear from your mainstream media. This deadline was actually in May, and at that point, that's when none of the states could issue their own bonds, and none of the municipalities could issue their own bonds. That's when they hit the debt ceiling. So I said to the financial officers of your states, I said, it's really not correct that the states' finances should be tied up because the Federal Reserve is dishonest and corrupt. This is not the kind of financial that we need in this country. And that is absolutely the case. And what a number of states have been doing. Some of the states have started organizing their own state banks. You have a good example of this in North Dakota. I think 22 states are busy with this. All of the states should do it. Some of the states have declared gold and silver as legal tender. All of the states should do this, the state legislatures. But the most important thing, I think, is our Constitution. In Article 5 says that when 2/3 of the state legislatures call for a constitutional convention, this shall take place. The Congress has no wiggle room there. There's no ends, if, or buts on this. The Constitution is very clear. And what happened in 1929 was we got 2/3 of the state legislatures to ask for this constitutional convention. And I think Wisconsin was the state. I think it was the 34th or the 35th. I forget which one it was. But so Wisconsin wrote their state legislature wrote a very strongly worded letter that I put up on my Facebook page, and I'm happy to give you a copy of that letter. And then in the interim, since 1929 and now, 49 states are now calling for this constitutional convention. So what you have is our forefathers made it very clear that we were a country that was governed by the consent of the governed. And they lost that consent. We're now up to 49 of 50 states. And somebody's asked me, who's the 50th state? I haven't done that research. By the way, I didn't know. I had said, and just thinking about where the problems were, that we needed a constitutional convention, but I wasn't aware of the history of all of this. And then, as my story got more public, there's a fellow named John de Herrera who's devoted his life to going to each and every state and explaining what this means. I'm getting a lot of pushback from people now. They're saying, there's no way that we could get our act together and do a proper constitutional convention. I think if you listen to people who have run for office and seen how difficult it is to get a clean representative and know these people know all the loopholes, I think enough of them could work together to figure out how to take back our government. I think we're on the ball enough to do this. I have confidence in us.
I'm with you on that. Like I said, I appreciate your optimism, and so you mentioned about writing, but what can we do? That's the big question. What can I do? What can those listening right now do? We want to get the criminals out of the place. We want justice. We want to remove the criminals. We're tired of being enslaved. The degradation to our planet. What do we do? Good
question. I like that question. The first thing, I think, and the most important thing, and what's all writing on it, is for us Americans to be aware of where we are and how we got there. And I think we've got the structure in our country. Once enough people know about it, they can get the others to understand it. I can keep on talking on podcasts till I'm blue in the face, but that's not going to do the trick. What's going to do the trick is if people themselves are talking to their neighbors and, to people in their community and their relatives, and we all work together to understand where we are. What I was saying about the World Bank whistleblowers being like Toto pulling the curtain back, that's what we've done. But we cannot do anything other than that. We can only show you what it is that's been hidden. And you all have to take the time to look at it, to understand it, and to make sure that enough other people understand it. And it's really not that difficult to understand. It's been done by keeping the press from telling you what's going on. It's a very simple thing. It's a cover-up. And the fact that you're just hearing about my story now, and yet it's been going on for so long, that just shows you the depth of the degradation of our press. And so once we understand this, and once the politicians understand that we know that we've been snookered, so that's all. You just have to admit that we've been snookered. And, we don't have to do anything else than show that we understand that we've been snookered, because I've just explained to you, our forefathers gave us the right to have a constitutional convention. and everything will flow from that. We don't have to panic. Now, this business about currency, I've been accused of being too optimistic. That's why I want the states to have declared gold and silver as legal tender, because the Fed is going to go. Once we understand that the Fed is, the Federal Reserve System is the wizard who's projecting this, this parade of horribles. The wizard was telling us we were going to have a war in Syria. They were telling us, they're telling us all kinds of misinformation, and there's all kinds of weird things going on, so people will panic. Don't panic. Don't believe your press. Just turn off your TVs and talk to each other and realize that we have everything we need in our own sweet time to take back our country. We've got our states that can govern our country. It's not like we've got to panic. We don't have to panic. We have perfectly good governments while we clean up this mess in the federal government. That's all. I mean, it's really, I don't have a huge, well-articulated plan. I don't need to, frankly, because all of the countries of the world, I've been writing the embassies for years. And what I did I guess it was 3 weeks ago, I wrote all of the embassies in New York because that's where the United Nations is. I wanted all of the countries to know about this cover-up. And what I told them about was, do you remember when Eliot Spitzer was fired as governor of New York because he was going after all of the crooked companies?
Mm-hmm.
The reason he was fired was because he went to see the New York Madam. And when the board of the World Bank was firing Paul Wolfowitz for giving a big pay raise to his girlfriend around the same time, the ambassadors representing the countries on the board were told that if they went to the New York Madam and they fired Paul Wolfowitz, this information would be made public. Well, these executive directors were not intimidated and they were not amused. I found out about this because I speak Dutch, having studied economics in Holland, and I happened to be in Holland when the representative of the Dutch government on the board, Herman Wijfels, wrote about this in a Dutch newspaper, and then the next day on the Dutch television, the man who had been on the board before Herman Wijfels, Ad Melkert, was asked whether he was also being blackmailed because Ad had been on the ethics committee. And Ad answered that, well, he was a boring guy, but he knew other people on the board that were being threatened with blackmail. It wasn't just whether they had gone to the New York Madam, it's whether they spent money in their banks, from their bank accounts in ways that made themselves vulnerable. This is the same kind of spying that the German government has used as a reason for not allowing the sharing of intelligence information anymore. And Germany buzzed the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt with a helicopter that flew 60 feet above the consulate and broke all the dishes. And, I was writing an article for the third biggest website for businesses in Germany, and they asked me the question, what signal was the German government sending? I said the signal was, according to a government official in Germany, the signal was to get our attention. So as the American people understand that our allies are telling us that we have a choice, we can kick out the Federal Reserve and take back our country, or we can lose our allies because they don't want their companies to be spied on and all their trade secrets stolen by these thugs and crooks. We have a perfect way to get rid of these thugs and crooks.
Okay, and
I don't know
that
we have to throw all of them in jail. I think that would be slowing things down, because if the people that work for these places think that they're all going to jail, nobody is going to give us the information or the cooperation that we need. I think we need to have the same approach that you have when you're dealing with the mafia. You let the little guys, the lieutenants, off the hook, and you go after the Don. That's what I think we need to do. But as I said, I'm just somebody who's trying to get ourselves moving in the right direction. I'm not going to be micromanaging how we're going to do it. But as I said, all of the citizens in the United States have a right to consent to their government. we're not firing our county executives. We're not firing our governors, not unless you know something I don't know. But I do think that our federal government has lost the consent of the governed, and we just need to go on without them for a while until we can sort them out.
So, Karen, how many former or current U.S. senators and representatives are aware of what's going on, and do you think any of them are ever going to come out publicly on this?
That's a perfect question. They are all aware. I've been writing to all of them.
Okay.
All of the people in the Senate, and I've been in touch with strategic committees in the House. Don't forget, the appropriations committees made a very specific provision that said that the effects of retaliation against whistleblowers should be eliminated. So when Timothy Geithner lied to both the House and Senate Appropriations Committee, I made it my business to go to the representatives on those committees. My governor, Martin O'Malley, wrote to me and said that I should use the Maryland delegation to clean up this corruption. And so, I went to Senator Mikulski and Senator Cardin. I have so much correspondence with various members of Congress, specifically on this, with the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. I wrote to Nancy Pelosi, and she told me to go to the representative in the House, who I was in regular correspondence with many, many times. He wrote a letter of inquiry to the World Bank, and then when he got a bad response, he refused to follow up on it. I met with him. You know what happened with Dominique Strauss-Kahn. I met with him directly and told him that the U.S. was losing its credibility with what had happened with Dominique Strauss-Kahn. That was a setup from start to finish. And he refused to clear the name of the United States. I could document, if anybody wants to know whether I've written any of their representatives, the answer is I've written to your senators many, many, many times. And chances are, if you're the member of in the House was involved in either the House Committee on Foreign Affairs or, there's so many committees, the banking committees, the House Finance Committee. I've been there many, many times. I didn't want to give up hope on our Congress until I absolutely had to.
Do you always get a response?
I got lots of responses.
How are they responding?
Well, if you go on my website, kahudes.net, you can see a lot of the responses. Don't forget there was a Government Accountability Office audit. I've written many, many times to the Joint Economic Committee, the Appropriations Committees. They are all supposed to be exercising oversight.
Okay. You mentioned Syria before, and I felt that we haven't been hearing much about Syria, and I find that to be very interesting. And I feel that that was actually an incident that showed to me that people are paying attention. We're not going to buy this time. How do you feel about that?
That's right. Let me tell you about what's going on in the Middle East. Syria was supposed to be the beginning of World War III. I agree with you entirely with what you said. But there is a lot about what's going on in the Middle East, because I was hired to the World Bank by the General Counsel, Ibrahim Shihada, who came to the World Bank from OPEC. And at a certain point, he was Egyptian. At a certain point, an Egyptian lawyer who had come from the military came to me 20 years ago and said, I'm going to introduce you to Egypt's representative on the board of executive directors. I don't want you to forget me. Well, I have not forgotten this person. We are in practice, and I am in touch with that representative who's now a senior member in the Egyptian government. So when Jacek Kugler came to the World Bank, what he said to me, this is the man who developed this stakeholder analysis that I've been following like a blueprint, which is very, very accurate and is telling me that we're going to have rule of law. Well, what Jacek Kugler said to me was that we are going to have a nuclear bomb in the Middle East if we do not get rule of law, if we do not get rid of the Federal Reserve. Although he didn't say get rid of the Federal Reserve. He knew what was going on behind the scenes It took me, many, many years to find this out. But he did an analysis of what's going to happen. And what his analysis predicts is that if the United States starts respecting the rule of law, that we are going to have a wonderful alliance, and that alliance is going to last for 50 years. And only when the economies in the East get much stronger will there be a gradual transfer of power, and not via a world war. See, the bankers like wars.
Right.
They really make out like bandits. They finance all of everything that goes up in smoke. They could care less that all of these people are getting killed. What they like is the loans that the countries are taking out to finance the wars that they can charge interest on. We had this business about the sarin gas was just an absolute, I was telling you, do not listen to the news that you're getting from the mainstream media. They are there to present a fiction to you, to manipulate you. That's all they're there for, to manipulate you. Do you want to be seen and laughed at as a dupe? That's what they're there for. They're to dupe you. So that was what Syria was. And, I was on a number of interviews, and I was talking about Syria being very strategic in the Middle East because of where the pipelines were going to go for natural gas, and why people were so anxious to get rid of Assad. It was just so that they could either get a pipeline or prevent a pipeline. That was what the war was about. It was about natural gas coming from the Middle East to Europe.
Thank you for sharing that, Karen. We were talking about war. My understanding and what I'm seeing and what I'm hearing over the years is that war is all about making money. It doesn't really have anything to do about the people or conflict. It's about making money, and they're all in cahoots to start these wars to make money.
That's exactly right. And what we've done now in exposing this corruption to the people is we've made it much more difficult to have war. And what you see in this false enmity between peoples, people are being played like a piano. And what you actually find is in all of these conflicts, if you drill down, you find the people who understand that they're being manipulated and that there's a solution to be found. You don't have to go out and kill each other. There are real conflicts. I'm not saying that conflicts are not real. I'm saying that solutions with war are usually there just for manipulation to make money. Mm-hmm. You don't have to resort to war for a solution.
Correct.
That's usually not a solution.
Absolutely correct. All right, once again, we're getting to the end here. I like to focus on solutions. I'm doing my part by having this interview with you, and thank you, Karen. I only discovered you and your work this past year, and you have exploded. Thank goodness for the internet, because if we didn't have the internet, we wouldn't have all this information, I don't think. Thank you for all that you've been doing. And I just wonder, as far as keeping it solution-based, in closing, recap what you think we should do.
Well, I think in going forward, I like focusing on solutions. It's a lot to take in right now for people who may feel lost. And so I can tell you, I can reassure you that everything that I've said, I've got documents for, and if there's anything that sounds confusing, there are ways to get yourself up to speed together with your neighbors. I mean, don't take things on faith because I look like I'm honest. I mean, you've got to learn to weigh and sort, because going forward, there are going to be a lot of things that have to be done differently. And the only way to know whether or not you're getting all the information that you need, don't just sit back and say, oh, my government, I live in a great country and my government's going to take care of it for me. This should set you straight that if you don't stay involved, it's not going to be in your interest what happens. So you stay involved. And one way to know whether you're getting the right information is to see what's happening to whistleblowers. Are they being harmed? If whistleblowers are being harmed, you know that you don't know what's going on, and you have no way of fixing things. So that's the very first thing, is see what's happening to your whistleblowers. And if they're not getting protected, you make it your business to protect them. And you hold your government accountable for protecting whistleblowers. And the other thing is, do not believe a single thing you hear on the mainstream media. You fire them. They have betrayed you. And go to the internet. But just end your subscription to the newspapers that you've been subscribing to. They're there to misinform you and manipulate you. Just fire those crooks.
Okay. Well, Karen, thank you so much. And I hope we get a chance to do this again. Lots developing here.
It would be great, Kimberly. Thanks for calling on me.
Thank you. Thank you for being there. Okay,
Bye-bye.
much love. Bye-bye.